Okay, so I'm just going to pick up any file here, and I'm just going to go to the DocuSign rooms so that you can see kind of what we're looking at as far as the contingency forms, what they mean, and how we navigate through them legally and protect our clients on both sides, whether we're in the buyer side or the seller side. Okay, let's go back here. All right. Okay, so when you're dealing with contingencies, there's two different kinds of contingencies that we see. Can you guys tell me what the two different contingencies are?
One is based on the sale of the current buyer's home.
Okay.
And the second would be because financing?
Well, they're both tied to the sale of the buyer's home.
Okay.
And financing. So they're both tied to that, okay? So when you're writing a contingency, you're stating that the buyer cannot or is not willing to, because they may be approved to, but they may not be willing to, buy a house until they sell their current house, period. So that's a contingency. A house has to sell before that buyer can proceed with buying. Okay, now the two different types of those contingencies are, number one, the buyer has to sell to buy, and their house that they have to sell is already under contract. And then the other one is they have to sell to buy, but their house is not under contract. So it's either not yet been listed, or it has been listed, but it has not received an offer yet. So does that make sense? The two different types?
Yes.
Okay, so you have a buyer, they want to go buy a new home, they currently own a home, and that home must be under contract, not closed, but under contract before they can proceed with writing an offer on another house. And that is contingency, that is the contingency presently under contract. Presently not under contract is their house is either active on the market or is going to be listed active on the market, and they need that property to sell before they purchase this new property. Now, let's talk about how that works. How much time do we need between the sale of the house that they have to sell before they can buy the house that they're buying? Anyone? Okay. There isn't, it just has to close before the purchase of the new house. So in many cases, when we're dealing with this, we're doing a back-to-back closing where we're closing on one, hypothetically at 10 a.m. and closing on the other at 11 a.m. As soon as the sale of their house is assigned and funded by the lender or funded by cash, then that is consummated, and they can then proceed with the purchase of the next house and close immediately afterwards. Okay? So we don't necessarily have to wait 24 hours. I have had some specifically dealing with VA buyers. I have had some VA lenders tell me, specifically national VA lenders, not local VA lenders, but I've had some national VA lenders tell me that, hey, we can't close them back to back. And that is not true. You absolutely can close a VA loan back to back because they can, because what they're saying is their eligibility from the first purchase is not restored in order for them to buy the second purchase, but they have the ability to work through that process and get that eligibility restored and still close them back to back. So please keep that in mind. If you ever hear a lender tell you, I cannot close a VA back to back because I have to be able to restore their eligibility before I can reissue a new loan, that is not true, and get with me and we can work through that. Because on VA loans, FHA loans, conventional loans, we can do those back to back as long as they qualify and have the funds and that property closes, okay? So let's talk about the simplest of these two first, and that's gonna be the contingency sale of the buyer's property presently under contract, this first one here. Now, when we check this box here, what must accompany that?
The supplement,
Right.
document for that.
Exactly. So anything that is selected here in any of these check boxes must have a supplement that goes with it. So let's explore what that supplement looks at or looks like. And we're going to add that here. And I'm going to add them both. Here they are. So there's the two separate ones. There's a separate form for each one, not under contract and under contract. So we're going to add those here and we're going to look through both of them so we clearly understand what each of them is telling us. And then what I want to talk about in detail about this is, what does your inspections period look like when you're dealing with a contingency as well? Where did they go? So presently under contract. Okay, so let's talk through this form. This is pretty straightforward. I'm buying a house. In order for me to close on this house, I have to sell my current home. My current home is already under contract. We're good to go. So here, this is just saying that this is a supplement to the Oklahoma real estate contract, and that this contract is conditioned upon the closing of their current property at, and you put either the legal description or the property address there, which is presently under contract. A copy of this contract is attached to the contract. That means that when you are sending over a contingency offer, you must also attach the complete offer of the sale of their house with the purchase contract of this house. Many people send this over and never send over the offer on their house. Can somebody tell me why it would be important to see the purchase contract of the house that they're selling?
Would it be to see like closing dates and if there's any like exclusions or weird financing, or if they have contingencies and stuff?
Yes, and primarily exactly what you said last. To see if they have contingencies is very important, right? Because if you're receiving an offer that's contingent and then the offer on the house that they're selling is contingent, we're just building layers, and it's not that it's a problem, but we need to know how complex of a deal we're dealing with. Are we waiting on an offer that's 2 or 3 closings deep, right? Meaning there's a contingency on one deal, they're buying a house, there's a contingency on another deal, they're buying a house, and then those people that are buying our house, it's contingent. So we're like the 4th one down the line. We want to try to investigate and understand as much as we can, knowing that we could be dealing with multiple realtors, multiple deals, even out of state, okay? That this could get complicated. We just need to know the picture, and we need to know who do we need to be communicating with throughout this process to make sure that we're closing on time. Is it at a different title company than where we're going to be closing at? So is there a multiple part, like is the deal that they're selling closing at OCA and the other one closing at Chicago Title? Now we got to get funds from OCA to Chicago Title the day of closing. We need to go from one title company to the other title company. Is there going to be any delays in that? Do we need to have some buffer in our closing times? So those are all things that we need to keep an eye on and be aware of, not necessarily to deter us from an offer, but to be have in front of us and to have a very close pulse on through the entire transaction. So you want to review that contract. You want to look and see if it's contingent. You want to look at the financing terms, see if there's anything unusual with that offer. You want to look at where it's closing, those types of things. Look and, see if it's a solid offer. If you think there's going to be some complications, there's nothing wrong with looking at that offer. And if they haven't done appraisal yet or inspections yet, seeing how long their inspection period is, checking to see if the house is, under contract for an appropriate value. You can run a CMA on it, see how comfortable you are with that deal. I wouldn't necessarily bust a deal because of it, but these are things that we need to be aware of and keep a pulse on this whole time. So make sure that if you get a contingency offer, you make sure to get a copy of that contract. And if you are sending a contingency offer, you send a copy of that contingency, that purchase contract as well. And then it just says here that if the buyer has not closed on the sale of that property or a longer period as the seller will grant in writing. So we put a date in there. So we put the closing date of our house. So if we say, hey, we're closing September 15th, then this is going to say if the buyer has not closed on the sale of this property by September 15th, or a longer period, if the seller agrees to a contract extension, then this contract becomes null and void. And the abstract, anything that the title has done, the abstract is returned to the seller and the earnest money is returned to the buyer, provided that the buyer shall nevertheless have the option to proceed with closing the contract regardless of the sale of their property by providing documentation that they can proceed. Okay? Does everybody understand this? This is the simple version of a contingency contract. I have to sell this property in order to buy this property. If this property sells, I will do a closing on this property either back to back or shortly thereafter. If this property doesn't sell, then this contract is null and void. The seller retains the property, the buyer gets the earnest money back. Okay? So unfortunately, in a contingency deal, you could get to right before closing, a deal could bust, and the buyers do retain the earnest money because it's busting because they are not approved to buy without selling, or they wrote it as a contingency because they were not comfortable buying without selling, and they retain the earnest money. Does everybody understand that? Okay, so let's now look at the second version of this, which was the bottom checkbox, which was I have to sell a property and this property is not under contract. Oops, I clicked the wrong one. Okay, so this means that one of two things. I have to sell my house in order to buy this house, and my house is either actively on the market or I'm getting ready to put my house on the market. So it can be either or. Okay, so let's walk through this. This supplement is an attachment and part of our contract of real estate between the buyer and seller. This contract is subject to termination for failure of buyer to sell the buyer's property located at, so it's all that is saying is this contract is subject to this property selling. If it doesn't sell, this offer is terminated. Now, this is where it's very important and we need to explain this to our buyers. Number one, if you are writing a contingent offer, their house must already be on the market. And tell me what is the specific condition with their house being on the market in option A here. What does this say?
Gotta have a buyer, the exclusive right to sell, like buyer broker agreement.
Not buyer broker. The
I
buyer's
mean,
property is,
the exclusive right to sell.
yes, listing agreement. So
Yes.
can you write a contingency for a buyer and they have their house listed for sale by owner?
No.
Not according to this form, right? This is saying that with my contingency, my buyer will have their house listed professionally with a real estate professional, okay? Now, option B. This option B is stating that my buyer is going to buy your house upon the sale of their house, and they are going to list their house within 2 days of acceptance of contract. So let's talk about that. This is acceptance of contract is once all parties sign the purchase contract, you have 48 hours to get that house on the market. That's contractually binding. If your buyers, a lot of times buyers want to go find a house before they put their house on the market. Okay, we hear that all the time. Well, I'm not going to sell my house until I buy a house or find a house that I love. Okay, well, that's great. And if it has to be contingent, then we must be ready to put your house on the market immediately when we put this contingency offer in. 2 days. If you cannot have their house on the market in 2 days, you must have all parties agree to an extension of this option B here, extending that 2 days out beyond to however many days that they need. Does everybody understand that? 48 hours is a quick time. Most sellers' houses are not ready to hit the market. So we need to be educating our sellers about this immediately when we start showing them homes. If they have to be contingent and their house is not on the market, they need to have their house ready to hit the market immediately as soon as they write that contingency offer. Now think about this. You write this contingency offer, it gets accepted. You have to order photos, get the photos done, get the photos processed and back to you, get this house on the market in 48 hours, which most photographers can return photos in 24 hours. That's fine. But that means they have to be ready immediately the next day to get those photos done so you can get it on the market. It's a very tight timeline. So educate your buyers about this up front so they're not shocked. Wait a minute, my house got to be on I got to do pictures tomorrow. My house is going to be on the market the next day. Make sure that we're preparing them for that, okay? Now, a lot of people, including our buyers, do not understand what number 3 states. So I want you guys to make sure that you're clear of this. The seller's property, when you are doing a contingency, when their property is not under contract, the contingency allows the buyer or the sellers to continue to put their house on the market and to show their home and to receive offers on their home. Does everybody understand that and know how to articulate that to their clients? Both on the seller side and on the buyer side.
So basically, they're technically not under contract, even if it's accepted, until their house goes under contract.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so from a seller's perspective, we could say, hey, think about this as like a pre-negotiated deal on your house, but we're still going to treat your house as if it was active on the market. We're still going to show it. We're going to do open houses on it. We're going to market the heck out of it to get it sold. And if we get another offer, great. And if not, we have this one in our hip pocket as soon as their house sells. So we're just pre-negotiating a deal. On the flip side, on the buyer, we need to explain to them, because I've seen buyers get upset, frustrated because they see this house being advertised, they see open houses, and they feel like, well, we just negotiated a deal on this house, yet they're still marketing it and trying to sell it. And so I tell them the same thing. Hey, we've got to focus on getting your house sold. So what we've done is we found this house you love. We're pre-negotiating a deal on it. We're giving you a foot in the door because you will have a kick-out clause. But we're getting your foot in the door with a pre-negotiated contract, and now we got to focus on getting your house sold so we can secure this deal completely. But it's not fair to the seller to take their house off the market completely in hopes that yours sells. Let's just focus on us getting your house sold, okay? Now, the seller, so this isn't risky for the seller. The seller could keep doing what they're doing, keep doing showings, open houses, accepting offers. Now, this next is the seller's demand to buyer to remove the termination condition. Now, if the seller receives and desires to accept a valid, bona fide written offer, including a backup supplement from a third party with no conditions other than inspections, title, survey, financing, then what does that mean specifically? If the seller receives and accepts, let's talk about that first. So you have this kick-out clause window. When does that kick-out clause window start? As soon as the offer is received? Or is the seller going to negotiate that deal first before the termination or before the kick-out time period starts?
It would be once it's fully executed, right? Once it's signed by both parties?
Exactly. Exactly. So you're representing the seller and you have a contingency offer on your listing. You get another offer. Your kick-out clause period, your 24 or 48 hour, whatever you agree to with that contingency buyer, doesn't start until you have negotiated and signed that second offer. Okay, so you receive that offer, you can counter it, you can accept it as is. You accept it as is, that doesn't mean you're under contract with the new party. That then means that you send a notice to remove the contingency to the first party and start that period of time. Is that clear? Now, where we run into a lot of concerns around this is, what happens if my first offer is for $250,000 net and my second offer, so the contingency offer is $250,000 and the second offer comes in better than that? What happens here?
Can't the buyers accept the better offer?
Can the sellers accept the better offer?
Yeah.
Well, they can accept it, but we've already pre-agreed to that other contract. So we have to do the kick-out clause, notify the buyers that we have received, the first buyers, that we have received another offer. And if those buyers can remove their contingency, then we are locked into that first contract and we have to proceed with the first contract, no matter how much better that second offer is.
Got it. If they can remove the contingency, then you're solid. It's a done deal.
Exactly. If they can remove the contingency in the specified time, which here it states no less than 24 hours. Okay. So default, you have 24 hours. So I notify you today, hey, I have received another offer. You don't disclose if it's good or bad or better or worse. You just say, hey, we have agreed to another offer. We're giving you formal notice to remove your contingency, and you have 24 hours to do so. If in that 24 hours, that buyer comes back and says, I'm removing my contingency and proceeding with our contract, then it doesn't matter how good that second offer is, they are going to proceed with that first offer. Okay? and you can't counter it, you can't renegotiate it, nothing. You're in that first offer. Okay? All right. So so the seller gives notice to the buyer to remove the condition. The buyer removes the condition in 24 hours, then we're under contract with the first buyer. If the buyer does not remove the condition in that period of time, then you can proceed with the second offer and the first offer terminates. And there's a form for this that we're going to look at in just a second, okay? But does everybody understand that? You guys got to make sure that you can explain this to your sellers so that you don't get a seller who gets pissed off when a second offer comes in higher and they can't proceed with that because the first buyer wants to move forward, okay? We have to set the expectations up front on what we're dealing with if we get these contingency offers. Okay, now a removal of termination condition. To remove the termination condition, the buyer shall have the buyer's property under contract to close on or before the closing date of this contract with no additional conditions, or they must get approval from a financial institution, a lender, or show sufficient funds to be able to close on this property without the sale of their property. So they can do one of two things: provide the contract, say, hey, look, we got our house under contract, we're moving forward, or B, we've got approval from our bank to be able to proceed without selling our house, so we're going to do that. I have seen buyers do that. They say, hey, we love this house, we want to write an offer on it, but we want to try to sell our house before we buy this house. We can buy without selling, but we want to write it as a contingency just because we're nervous. But then another offer comes in and their kick-out clause gets activated. And then they say, okay, great. We love this house. We don't want to risk losing it. We're willing to buy it without selling our house, and they proceed. So you will have people that do that, and that's totally fine. They write it for peace of mind to try to get their house sold. But if push comes to shove and it's going to come down to them losing the house, they will proceed with purchasing. There are people that will do that, and that's totally okay. Okay. Now, let's talk about, you have a seller, you have a contingency offer not under contract on your property. So we're dealing with this. Their house is not under contract. And you get another offer on that property, and it is a contingency. Can you accept it and activate the kick-out clause?
No, because you're already in a contingent offer, and so you have to give them, the buyers, the first offer, the chance.
Okay.
Right? You
Partially
can't have
correct. That was a trick question, and that's partially correct. So, okay. So again, remember there's two types of contingencies. So if you have a contingency not under contract and you receive another contingency and it's not under contract, then we can't kick out one contingency for another contingency, because it says in here that you have a bona fide offer with no other conditions other than inspections, financing, and a sales agreement subject to the buyer's property getting under contract, or buyer's property selling, right? So if you have a contingency not under contract, you cannot kick that contingency out for another contingency not under contract, even if it's $1 million higher. Can't do it. Now, if you receive a second offer that is contingent, that is a bona fide offer, that is the first deal that we talked about with their house being contingent presently under contract, then that's a bona fide offer with a bona fide closing date that we can proceed with, correct? So that is a valid offer that we still got to get through financing and appraisal and inspections, but it still has a closing date and we can proceed. So that itself is allowed, okay? Do we understand the difference between the two?
Yes.
Okay, contingency not under contract cannot kick out a contingency not under contract. But a contingency under contract can kick out a contingency not under contract. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So in any event, buyers shall give notice to the seller of removal of condition within the time period specified in paragraph 4. Such notice shall be accompanied by whichever is applicable: a true copy of a valid bona fide purchase contract of the buyer's property, or written verification from the financial institution in showing that the funds are available or financing is available. Okay. And any notice received from the buyer shall be acknowledged by the proper recipient in writing and shall specify the time and date of delivery. Because this is a very short window and this is a very touchy situation, we must be very, very, very clear on the delivery times on this, because we don't want to send something to somebody at 10 o'clock at night and start the clock without formally giving them notice that, hey, I'm sending this to you, right? It's not the ethical thing to do. So we got to make sure that we're noting the times, we're communicating the receipt, and starting the clock when both parties have acknowledged and received this documentation, okay? And then section 6 just says the failure of the buyer to remove the condition. If a buyer, after given notice from the seller, fails to remove their termination condition within that period specified, then the contract terminates, and the seller, in the event that the seller does not deliver the demand to remove the condition to the buyer, then the contract shall automatically terminate and become null and void. The buyer shall release the seller and the brokers and cannot claim any kind of loss. Earnest money shall be dispersed according to the provisions of the contract. Okay? All right. So one of the most tricky things that we come across in this is around inspections, around financing and appraisals, right? Do we, when we're dealing with this, and we have a buyer who wants to buy a house and their house isn't under contract, and they may not even get this house because they may be kicked out due to the kickout clause, then what happens? Does the buyer start their inspections right then on a property that they may or may not get? Does the lender order the appraisal in advance on a property that they may not get? Or do we open title and open the file with the lender once the condition is removed? Because this doesn't address that. This is a gap, in my opinion, in those things. Because the purchase contract states that your time reference date begins when all parties sign the contract, right? So it's a pre-negotiated contract for a deal that may or may not happen. But there's really nothing in here that addresses what happens with any of that stuff. So do you want your buyers to do inspections up front, to do an appraisal up front, in hopes that they don't get kicked out and they can proceed with this? Or should we write something in the purchase contract that says when those time periods start?
Write something in the contract.
I would agree with that. So there's no place on here that addresses it or that you can add it in. So what I often do, just to protect my buyers from spending money on appraisals and inspections, is I will write something in right here in time periods and inspections. So if you're writing a standard contract without a contingency, then you can just leave this blank, because that will give you time to negotiate the deal, and your time period's not starting before that deal is signed by all parties. Because by default, it starts after all parties have signed. Now, in the case of a contingency, you may consider writing here that the signatures, the date, that the time reference date begins after the contingency is removed, after all parties have signed the contingency removal. If we do that, then that defaults us into starting our time reference date after the contingency removal. Does that make sense? Because if not, it's not very clear on is this time reference date referring to the contract that we signed when it was contingent not under contract, or is that time reference date tied to the contingency and when the contingency is removed? Do you guys understand how that can cause a lot of confusion and a lot of problems between a buyer and a seller because we don't have a clear time reference date?
Yes.
You put that in that little box, you don't do it in the, you put it in that little box.
So you can put it in here and say, you know, time reference date shall be the 3rd day after all signatures are received on the contingency release. That doesn't give you much room there. I would in most cases go down to 13 additional provisions and say in there, section 5, in reference to time reference date shall begin on the 3rd day after all parties sign the contingency release.
But doing that, you go back to 5 and put it in that box.
You could put C section 13 and reference down there so it's very clear. You know what I mean? Because section 13 gives you the room to really articulate what you're saying. So in 5, in that small blank, you can say C13, and then in 13, you can say in reference to section 5, time reference date, and really specify what that looks like. And you can also note in there that the, you know, the appraisal will be ordered once the contingency is removed as well.
I think number 5 is something in blank.
Mm-hmm.
Clear to that.
Right, because you're going to point to where you're referencing it at. So does that make sense to everybody? Because we really don't want to get our buyers in a bind to where the seller's pushing back. And I have read through this contract over and over again to find out how we can tie a date to a contingency, and there isn't anything that addresses it. So do we assume that it's when the signatures on the contingency removal happen, or do we assume that it's on the contract? I don't like assumptions. I don't like putting my buyers or sellers at risk or leaving them open to risk. So I just feel like to dot all of our I's and cross all of our T's, let's tighten up our verbiage in this contract. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So we're going to use section 5 and section 13 when we're dealing with a contingency not under contract, only for not under contract to do this. If our contingency is under contract already, then we don't need to worry about calling out different time periods. Okay? Now, I want to show you what we use when we need to remove a condition. Now, this is one form, and this form is used by either side when they want to remove a condition, okay? And so part of the form is addressed for the buyer and part of the form is addressed for the seller. Okay, so first we're gonna look at the top part. So this top part is gonna be demand from the seller to remove the condition. So when would a seller do this? When would a seller demand the buyer to remove the condition? When they've got a non-contingent under contract in hand.
Not signed, so they can move it, right?
Well, they can sign and accept that other offer, but that offer is not officially accepted until this condition is removed. Yes. So you have a seller, we have a contingency not under contract, we receive another offer, we negotiate that other offer, we come to terms. but that offer's on hold because we have this contingency kind of lingering back here that we've got to deal with. At this point, we know we send this notice to remove contingency. And this is in reference to that 24 hours in the form we were just looking at. So it says to Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, in accordance with the contract of sale of real estate between the buyer and the seller on property located at whatever, and is modified by the sale of the buyer's property not under contract, you are hereby notified that the seller has accepted another offer conditioned upon your right to remove the termination condition. So this is all this is saying is, Mr. Buyer, I, the seller, have received another offer that I have agreed to. Because we have this pre-negotiated deal, I'm notifying you that you have 24 hours or whatever was in the contract to remove your condition and proceed with my purchase. Okay, that's what it says. Now, you have until, and this is where we're going to put the time reference. So whatever we agreed to, if it was 24 hours, make sure you're giving them at least 24 hours here. You have until such and such date and time to remove your termination condition. In the event that you fail to remove the condition within that time period, then this will automatically terminate your contract and your earnest money will be dispersed according to the contract. Okay?
I have a question about the earnest money.
Yes.
With this contingency thing, so you're still, like, you would still need to, if you're representing the buyers, deposit that earnest money check to you still move forward with that part of
Yes.
the contract and all of that. Okay.
Right. And the reason this is saying, hey, the earnest money will be dispersed according to the contract, because if you don't specify, hey, we're not going to start the time reference date, we're not going to start the inspection period until after the condition's removed, then we could be in our inspection period and they could have bypassed the inspection period, and then we could have this gray area of what happens to the earnest money. Is that clear?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Now, as long as we write that provision in, then that protects their earnest money, that protects their right to inspect the home after the condition's removed. If they choose to inspect it before, then that's fine. That's on them, right? So we're just giving notice, we're dating it, we're signing it, and then we must receive receipt back, receipt acknowledged at whatever date and time. So whoever's representing the other party, either that agent or those buyers need to sign saying, we acknowledge receipt of your notice of removal of the contingency. Okay? Now down here, it's the flip. The bottom half is for the buyer. This is for the buyer saying, hey, I either have received an offer on my house and now I'm under contract, or I've received funds to be able to proceed with the purchase. So it's notifying to Mr. and Mrs. Seller on the property, whatever. The buyer hereby removes the condition, and it tells them why they're removing it. Because we have a contract, or because we have the money to buy the house. You date it, and then the buyers sign it, and then the seller's agent or the sellers themselves acknowledge receiving it. At this time, if this bottom part happens, then that seller's property officially goes to pending status. And that first buyer is under contract.
That means if we, on the seller side, receives back some of the buyer, okay,
Mhm.
they're not in, we then have 24 hours to make that activity.
Well, that means immediately you can't show it, you can't do anything else. Immediately. There isn't a 24-hour period. This means that immediately we're officially now under contract and that property is pending. There isn't a time frame that says how quickly you need to put it to. Our whole contract, if there isn't a time frame listed, it's time is of the essence, meaning as quickly as possible. what this does mean is if you don't put it to pending, you cannot continue to show it. You cannot continue to receive offers on it. Okay, that would be a violation. Okay, but there isn't a time period called out here. Okay, time is of the essence. Okay, so sellers demanding, buyers notifying to remove. That's the two, okay? And that's how all of those pieces come together. And in order to complete our file, we need to make sure that we follow this process. We check the checkbox, whichever is applicable at the beginning of the contract. We provide the appropriate supplement, whether it's condition not under contract, condition under contract. And then when we need that removed, we use this form to remove it, okay? All right. That is, in essence, the contingency process. We talked about at the beginning that with contingencies, we can close them back to back. You know, as soon as the one is funded, the next one can proceed with closing. So they could be a 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock closing. There's nothing wrong with that. We just need to make sure we're communicating with the lenders and the title companies that these are back-to-back transactions so that they can plan accordingly as well, okay? So anytime I am dealing with a contingent contract, I make sure to have that conversation on day one with the listing agent or with the co-op agent, with the title company, with the lender. Hey, this is going to be a back-to-back deal. Here's the other deal that it's contingent upon, so that they can start linking them together and making sure that everything runs smoothly. Okay? All right. Are there any questions around contingency conditions? Okay. Now we're going to move on and talk about the escalation clause.
I'm sorry, Nicole. I do have one question. It's
Yeah.
something that just came up. So there was a house that we were representing the buyers that we looked at, and the listing agent had said best and final offers by 4 o'clock that day.
Yep.
So we were working on getting an offer put together, and she called us before 4 and said the sellers have accepted an offer. And this was like 2-3 weeks ago.
Okay.
And we were like, oh, okay. They're like, but they're accepting backup offers. And our clients decided they didn't want to do a backup offer. But I noticed in MLS and everywhere else, it was still showing as active and didn't go pending until yesterday. Did they leave it active because they were accepting backups?
That's a violation if they did, because when you have an accepted offer, that's why they changed and just had to have the backup offer option. They are not allowed to keep it active. They can simply put it pending and use the backup offer field.
Okay, that's what I thought it was for.
Unless they accepted a contingency. I have seen some people accept a contingency not under contract because it was a really good deal. And they felt like their house was going to sell quick. So that would be the only time that would really be allowed, is if they accepted an offer that was contingent, not under contract. But if you're getting multiple offers, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's pretty rare for somebody to accept an offer that's not under contract.
Right. And for her to say they've accepted and like our offer would be a backup offer, and for it to still be active, it was really confusing.
Yeah, that seems like it would be some type of violation there.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so let's talk about escalation clauses. So does anybody can anybody tell me what an escalation clause is?
When you're in a multiple offer or could be in multiple offer, and you say like, I will go, whatever the top offer is, I'll go up a certain amount over it up to a certain final number.
Yes, that is correct. Okay, so an escalation clause is you're in a multiple offer situation, you're representing your buyer. Your buyer says, hey, I really want this house. It's listed at 150,000, or my initial offer is 150,000. you can then submit your offer with an escalation clause saying, I'm submitting an offer for $150,000. That is my offer. And the escalation clause states that, but if there's an offer that beats mine, I'm willing to beat any offer on the table by $1,000 or $500, whatever the case may be. You write that in, not to exceed a certain dollar value. Okay, so for example, $150,000 house, you write the offer for $150,000. Say, I'll give you full asking, $150,000. And I will beat any other offer that you receive by $1,000 so as to not exceed the purchase price of $160,000. So if they get an offer for $57,000, then your buyer's offer now becomes $58,000. If they get an offer for $59,000, your buyer's offer becomes $60,000. If they get an offer for $60,000, then yours can go up to $60,000 and they can compare and choose which one they want. But if they get anything higher than $60,000, then your buyer's offer is no longer the highest offer. Does that make sense?
Yes. And where do you write the escalation clause at?
So there is not a form for an escalation clause. We had been using a, let me see. We have been using just a templated one, but there's not a form. And it was just like verbiage that we added to a blank addendum or a blank supplement. And there was just some verbiage that we had ran through our attorney here at the office and said, hey, how do we specifically need to word that? So do you want me to give you the wording of that now?
That would be super, or if it's easier, if it's long, if it's easier to email or text.
Okay, it's not super long.
Okay.
The purchase price offer will escalate automatically to exceed the purchase price of any other offer by, and then that's going to be blank dollar amount, to a maximum purchase price of blank, listing agent to provide copy of the first page and the last page of offer used to escalate this offer as proof to selling agent, period.
All right. Will you go, I got lost after other offer by blank amount, any offer, any other purchase price by blank amount.
So I'm
Sorry.
gonna read it again. No, you're good. So the purchase price offer will escalate automatically to exceed the purchase price of any other offer by, and that will be a blank, and that's where you'll put your $1,000, $500, whatever, to a maximum purchase price of blank. That's where you write the maximum amount that they're willing to pay. Are we good there?
Yes.
Listing agent to provide a copy of the first and last page of offer used to escalate this offer as proof to selling agent.
Nicole, you said as proof to selling agent.
Yes. So
Okay.
that's giving proof to the person representing the buyer as to why it jumped in price. Like, we don't want to send an escalation clause and the listing agent just say, well, my buyer or my sellers want $5,000 more, so let's just bump their offer up because they're willing to do it, right? We also
Right.
have to have proof that we had a bona fide offer to drive that price up.
And you say we just we can use a blank addendum for this
A blank
escalation
addendum or a
clause.
blank supplement is perfectly fine. You can put it in the additional provisions as well. I want you guys to make sure if you put it in the additional provisions that we talk to the agent and make sure that they see it. We don't want it to get overlooked. Same thing with any attachment too. You want to make sure that they see that as well. Is that good?
Yes.
Yes.
And
That
if
helps.
you're putting a cap on it, right? You're not giving them an indefinite amount of money to go up. We want to keep in mind appraisal value and things like that on this deal as well. Okay. All right. So we talked about contingencies. We talked about escalation clauses. Let's talk about the VA and FHA repair conditions that Stephanie, that you were asking about. So her example, which we talked briefly about at the beginning of class, was that she has a buyer who is wanting to buy a property using a VA loan. And many of the properties that he is interested in have some conditions that when the appraiser comes may require those conditions to be fixed before closing. And the properties are being listed for sale as is. Okay, so what I want to look at here is the VA loan. Where is it at? There it is. Okay, so the VA loan, when we're signing off on that, it does have that the sale is subject to the repair of any conditions or the removal of any of those conditions. Appraisal requirements here. So in section 4, in the event repairs are required by the VA appraisal that are not otherwise mutually agreed, then the buyer shall have 5 days from being advised to agree to an acceptable arrangement regarding the cost of those repairs. If a written agreement is not reached within that time period, then this contract terminates and the earnest money goes to the buyer. So what this means is that if you have a VA loan and the appraiser comes back and says, hey, these things have to be done before closing, this allows the buyer and seller to negotiate those repairs, in addition to whatever they've negotiated in the TRR. So if they say it's as is, this still comes into play. And if the appraiser comes back with conditions, then Stephanie, you can go back and say, hey, we're not asking for any repairs as part of the TRR, but the appraiser is requiring them, and you can negotiate how you're going to handle just those repairs.
Oh, okay. Okay. So we would say this isn't from a general inspector. This is from the VA appraiser.
Right. And they're looking for health hazards, safety hazards, things that will degrade the home, such as like peeling paint, rotting wood, things, because those things will progressively get worse, broken windows, those types of things.
And then if they just straight up say no, then deal best if they won't get to the appraisal if the VA, right?
They won't. So then if those conditions come up and the seller says, I will not fix them, the buyer does have the option to fix them at their own expense prior to closing. And I have had buyers do that. I've had buyers who wanted a house and they said, you know what, we know you're selling it as is, whatever conditions the VA comes up with, or in this instance, it was a Native American loan, whatever instance that they come up with that require us to fix, we will go ahead and take care of it. They fixed a couple of things, got them cleared by the appraisal. You're running the risk that if the deal busts, your buyers fix some things on a property that,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? But
Right.
if they want the property and you're already through the appraisal and this is the only thing holding you up.
Right. Is there I thought I'd heard there was some sort of a clause you could put in to protect, or something you can put in basically saying if the VA appraises, we offer 160, VA appraises it at 130, like protection of like they'll basically saying the seller will take care of VA appraisal items or negotiate price, or is that just what number 4 is saying?
So the VA amendatory clause states that the buyer shall not incur any penalty or forfeit the earnest money or otherwise obligated to complete the purchase. And this is in the FHA too, by the way. If the contract price or cost exceeds the reasonable value of the property established by the VA. So that's from the appraisal. The buyer shall have the privilege and option of proceeding with consummation of the contract without regard to the amount of value established by the VA. So what this is saying is that if the VA appraisal comes in at a lower value, that the buyer can still proceed with purchasing it, but they can only finance the amount that the appraisal comes in at. So for that amount over, you either have to reduce the purchase price as the seller, the buyer needs to come up with the cash to cover the difference, or they can negotiate and meet in the middle. It doesn't, but it says that if they can't agree, then the contract is released and the earnest money goes back to the buyer.
Can you say that one more time, Nicole?
So if an appraisal comes in under, and let me be clear, this is for conventional, FHA, and VA. Any loan that you're getting, the purchase price or it cannot exceed the amount that is determined to be the appraisal value. So if you have a house and you're under contract for $225,000 and the appraisal comes in at $220,000, that means that that max value can only be $220,000 from a loan's perspective. So now we have a gap of $5,000. What are the options for that gap? Number one, the seller to just reduce the price to $220,000 and call it a day, and the seller takes that loss. Number two, the buyer says, okay, I really want this house. I will come up with an additional $5,000 cash because I know my loan can only be based off of $220,000. So I will come up with $5,000 difference because they have to come up with that full amount in cash. Or all parties can agree to split the difference somehow. And I've seen that happen where, hey, a seller took $1,500, a buyer took $1,500, a realtor took $1,000, one realtor took $1,000, one realtor took $1,000 to make up the difference. I mean, you can come up with the difference in any way, shape, or form to get to that value. But know that their loan cannot be based on anything over what the appraisal value is. And how you cover that difference is up to you. And if we can't agree to cover that difference, then the contract will be released and the earnest money goes back to the buyer.
Have you ever seen anything where, they say, oh, we're selling as is, and you come back with VA appraiser stuff, and they say, come back and say, no, we said it was as is. Like,
it states in here in the appraisal requirements that nobody is necessarily agreeing to fix those things up front. It's stating that when those requirements come in, we will address them and determine how that will be handled. And if we cannot come to an agreement, then we will release the contract and the buyers will get their money back.
Okay, so, but there's no verbiage or clause or anything to try to
not
protect.
Built into the contract. You can write something in additional provisions that says seller agrees to complete any repairs required by the VA appraisal. Understand that that's risky. If you're representing the seller, you're basically writing a blank check, because what if they require something major?
Right.
Now you're pre-agreeing to that. That's why it's kind of risky to do that.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
You're writing a blank check saying, hey, I don't care what it costs. I'm going to agree to fix it.
Could you put at least like seller agrees to negotiate
It already
any?
says that in
Yeah.
in 4. It already says
Yeah.
that the buyer and seller shall have 5 days to make arrangements to
Right.
negotiate those things. It already says that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's already implied in the contract
Right.
itself.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Okay. All right. That is all that I had for today. Does anybody have any questions? We have about 12 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions about what we talked about today, or any future topics you want me to talk about, or anything you want me just to answer right now? Okay, no, we'll get with your stuff after this. Anything?
Yes, I have one question. How often do realtors hire appraisers to come appraise the home before, we put in offers for the home?
Beforehand?
Yes, beforehand.
Pretty rare. Though I've seen realtors who were going to list the house and they were concerned about the price because it was maybe hard to comp out, and they did that. But it's pretty rare, and you can have 5 different appraisals and get 5 different values. So just because you have one appraisal that says one value doesn't mean that's what it is. So that's touchy, but you absolutely can do something like that. As a buyer's agent, that would be pretty rare because it's already being done with their loan. So there's no real need to pay for a second one. And the only time really on the seller side would be if you're really stuck on pricing or you're in a disagreement with the sellers on where it should be listed at, having an independent opinion of value. That would, that may be beneficial, but I would also make sure to tell them that just because we get this opinion of value from this appraiser doesn't mean that that's the same opinion of value we're going to get from the second appraiser, because additional deals could happen between now and then. And it's an opinion of value, an appraisal. It's not an exact science.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You can consult, like if you're worried about conditions, you could consult with one and say, hey, based on VA requirements or FHA requirements, like what do you see? And have maybe pay a consultation fee to have them look at those things so you can get ahead of them. You know what I mean? But that's kind of up to you if you want to have that expense or not. Okay. Any other questions? I hope this was helpful. There's so many intricacies with contingencies, and it's all about communication. And if you're unsure when you're dealing with a contingency, please get with me. If you're writing an escalation clause, run it through me. If you're dealing with VAs and appraisal requirements, or even any inspections, just get with me. Like you don't have to have a scheduled appointment for those types of things. We can just hop on a call real quick and talk through them. Because I know some of those things, time is of the essence to respond to. So let's just make sure we're talking through all of those and we're protecting our clients to the best of our ability. Does anybody have anything else before I disconnect?
Oh, thank you, Nicole.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thanks, Nicole.
All right, bye-bye guys.
Bye.